Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for tonight's event with James Queally in conversation with Michael Connelly, here to discuss All These Ashes. Tonight's event will end with a Q&A, and to submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. If you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, you can click the like button and it'll bump it up in the queue, and we'll try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Please also feel free to engage with each other and the conversation in the chat area. Since it's virtual, it's nice to know that you're all here. And we'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, so you can learn more about them on our website. You can sign up for our email newsletter. You can follow us on social media at Book Soup. And you can also follow our Crowdcast page right here, or you can catch past events on our YouTube channel. Please support Book Soup and our authors tonight by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book. You can do that by clicking the green button right below the viewer screen. It'll redirect you to our website where you can complete the checkout process. And we do have signed book plates from James, so take advantage of that. It's always nice to have signed book plates and make your purchase a little more fun. So thank you for supporting independent bookstores and our authors. And we're also open for in-store browsing. So if you're local to Los Angeles, please come by the store daily from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. and we would love to see you. And with that said, let me introduce our guests for this evening. James Queally is an award-winning crime reporter for the Los Angeles Times and the author of the acclaimed novel Line of Sight. Throughout his career, Queally has covered hundreds of homicides as well as national use of force controversies and the Black Lives Matter movement. His short stories have appeared in Thug Lit, Crime Syndicate Magazine, Shotgun Honey, and more. And our In Conversation guest tonight, Michael Connelly, is the author of 35 previous novels, including the New York Times bestsellers The Law of Innocence, Fair Warning, The Night Fire, and Dark Sacred Night. His books, which include the Harry Bosch series, the Lincoln Lawyer series, and the Renee Ballard series, have sold more than 80 million copies worldwide. And Connelly is a former newspaper reporter who has won numerous awards for his journalism and his novels. He is the executive producer of Bosch starring Titus Welliver and the creator and host of the podcasts Murder Book and The Wonderland Murders. He spends his time in California and Florida, and we are happy to have both James and Michael here with us tonight. Thank you both for joining us at Book Soup. And for the audience at home, thank you as well, and please enjoy the presentation.
All right. I guess it's just you and me now.
Oh, no.
I feel like I'm looking at my Zoom picture here. I'm looking at myself 30 years ago because, I had darker hair back then, had the cool beard. And I was a reporter at the LA Times trying to write novels on the side, hoping that I would have to be a journalist on the side someday. But that's where you are now. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. And this is the book we're talking about, All These Ashes. And before we start, James, I think you want to kind of set the tone here by making a short reading from the book. So why don't you go ahead with that?
Yeah, we're going to read the opening scene, which is the only scene in the book not from Russell's point of view. So if you need East Coast smack talk or creative profanity, you're going to have to buy it. Other than that, we're going to read the horrible crime that opens the book. Shayna Bell refused to die on her 16th birthday. She brought her fist down against the old wooden door once, twice, 10 times, until the heat on her skin forced her to retreat, until the smoke creeping into her nose and over her tongue crawled into her throat, prompting a guttural, violent cough that nearly sent her to the floor. Backpedaling down the wooden stairs and into the basement, she nearly tripped over her younger sister's prone form. Adriana had been curled up there, crying, little yelps escaping her lips ever since the door slammed shut. But now she wasn't moving. For just 1 second, Shayna was appreciative of the smoke obscuring her vision. Thick, gray charcoal smoke, the kind that billows from a burning building, the kind that kills you on your 16th birthday. Shayna clawed at her dress, grateful she'd gotten done up for the rendezvous that had gone horribly wrong, feeling lucky that the royal blue garment came with a shoulder wrap she was able to stretch over her mouth and nose. The smoke would kill you before the flames, or at least that's what the man in the Newark Fire Department uniform had said during that one safety drill they held in the Weequay High School gym every year. Shayna wished he was here now, destroying the door with an axe, freeing her and her sisters and her cousins, getting them out before the smoke choked them to death, or before the building collapsed on top of them. She looked at the door again, remembering her last failed attempt to break free, wondering if escape would even do her any good. they were still out there. They had to be. Either way, Shayna was going to need help to bring the door down, and Adriana wasn't getting up. Just 13, with bones thin like a bird, she wasn't qualified for the task anyway. Shayna turned to Lavelle and Curtis, her cousins, the two brothers who probably agreed on little, aside from the fact that they didn't want to be in this basement as it turned into a little hell. Lavelle, the skinny one of the two, had been staring at her the whole time, arms wrapped around his knees, tears running down his face, then disappearing so fast they might as well have turned into steam. Curtis, with his wide shoulders and workhorse frame and body perfect for barreling through the door, was lying face down. His hands were tucked toward his stomach, trying to pin shut the hole that matched the one through his back. Curtis had been shot with the same gun used to march them past the now locked door, the gun held by the same person who'd shoved Shayna down the stairs before she woke up in an inferno. Probably the same person who'd set the blaze, swallowing everything around them. Probably the same person who tried to sentence 4 people to death. The smell of rot filled Shayna's nose, a reminder of her decrepit surroundings, the abandoned buildings, the row of leftover homes they pretended were their own private neighborhood, the little world they were going to start together, the place where their secret wasn't a scandal but a preview of the promise where they could just exist side by side. Right up until that promise was betrayed with a bullet. Shayna ran for the door again, the need to know why pushing her even as the smoke starved her lungs, making every move 10 times more difficult than it needed to be. Shayna pounded, punched, screamed, prayed, not caring that the heat was making her flesh one shade darker, not caring that she was too small to break through, barely noticing the nails driven into the door at odd angles, ensuring the basement would be her tomb. Shayna's legs started to sink away from her body, the rest of her frame folding over with them. She collapsed into a ball on the stairs, her vision strained, blurred, faded. Her brain flickered on and off, a fluorescent in its final moments. Shayna Bell was going to die on her 16th birthday. All she could do now was pray for one grim gift, that the fireman was right, that the smoke would put her to sleep before the fire made her suffer.
All right. So while you were reading, I was looking at who's checking in here, and you got fans from all over the place. A lot of Jersey, a lot of Brooklyn, a lot of New York, but some Idaho, some Ontario, as in Ontario, California. So thanks everyone for coming and supporting the book and supporting Book Soup. I think so. This book, All These Ashes, is the follow-up to your debut novel, Line of Sight, and both books stand completely on their own. They have something in common, and that's Russell Avery, the protagonist. That after that stirring introduction that you just read, he takes over the story in his first person. But I think we got to talk a little bit about both of those books. One reason is that you got a bad break last year. Your debut novel debuted at the same time the pandemic debuted, and I think bookstores closed. We hadn't really put together this idea of virtual events and so forth. And I even heard a story that you were like on the subway going to a signing when New York shut down. Do you want to tell, before we get into the book, tell us about that? What happened?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to have 2 live events, one in Hoboken and one in Staten Island, where my family is last year. But the third and last one was kind of nearly a disaster. I was scrambling to get into the city, had to run to a ferry, and I'm getting on the 1 train. The mayor of New York City is having his press conference where he's basically talking about shutting the city down as I'm trying to get up to the Upper West Side to have this event. I was in the Starbucks adjacent coffee area in the front of Shakespeare & Co. in Manhattan. There were maybe 6 people there. A lot of my friends, and understandably, did not want to show up because they were afraid of the virus. So I had maybe 6 people there, and 2 of them were typing and working possibly on their own manuscripts or whatever they were doing the whole time I was there. And I pretty much had I got to drown my sorrows with 4 people, including a reporter friend, thankfully, who did show up in a old Irish bar. And that was pretty much my last night out for the better part of the last 18 months, but last 12 months following that. So yeah, real fun to, try to, I guess,
all right, well,
living in my head for 4 years. And yeah, then that happened in the same week he finally got to debut.
Hopefully things are better this time. And You got a lot of people here, so that's great. Book Soup is good for doing that, for sure. So both of these books are narrated or carried by the journalist turned private eye, Russell Avery. So why don't we start there? Where does Russell come from?
For anybody who's met me, Russell is a not terribly disguised version of me. Certainly not a one-for-one, but, punches people a little more than I think I'm normally allowed to do while carrying an LAPD verified press credential. But, he's a reporter who had been working in Newark at a fictionalized version of the paper that I used to work at, the Star Ledger. We called it the Signal Intelligencer, a little head nod to my college paper. He, at the beginning of Line of Sight, is now out on his ass, basically. He'd been laid off / forced out of the office. I'll let you figure that out on your own if you haven't read the first book. And is now working as a private investigator, but doesn't really know what he's doing. He's more or less been relying on his cop sources to fast track his license, and they're giving him work mostly to help them get out of personal jams, minor IA complaints. And that's the backstory. And then as the book starts, he's starting to get involved with officers who have more, as he puts it, real indictable problems, which tend to make him more money, but also start to strain his morality. And he then starts to come across, work that is not that, work that puts him at odds with the police department. And that really sets up the conflict of the first novel as he goes from, throughout his career and now his second act, being overly reliant on law enforcement and maybe seeing the world a certain way to experiencing, what it's like to be on the other end of the badge and the gun, basically.
And you've been a journalist for many years. And if you're not writing opinion columns at a newspaper, you're not usually writing in first person, and you're not part of the story. You're not driving the story. In this book, it's first person, and obviously the narrator, Russell Avery, is pushing the action of what happens. So why that choice, and was it a difficult transition to make in your writing to drop into first person narration?
It was at first. There's a different version, not involving Russ, of a Newark novel that is buried in a drawer in that room that no one's ever going to see, that I had written in third person. And it just wasn't working for me. I then, this was years and years ago, started writing shorts probably in 2013, 2014. And I was writing those in first person. And that got me used to just that style of writing. I still do somewhat find myself restraining opinions, even if it's laundered through Russell, even if it's laundered through another character's point of view. Because even though these books aren't set in LA, and even though they do comment on issues in the criminal justice system, issues when it comes to matters of policing, use of force, in this book, obviously wrongful convictions are a central theme. I still do try to be cautious, or at least make them more, I guess, what we would call in an opinion column, kind of like a reported out column, as opposed to just a straight opinion, because I'm still trying to be careful that the books don't spill over into betraying some kind of bias in my day in, day out reporting. So the tonal shift was easy. The keeping myself from betraying too much of a personal opinion was a lot harder.
Well, you're journalist by day, novelist by night. What about the transition from the pressure of having to be right, of being factually correct, and all the pressure that comes from writing news stories on deadline, to writing fiction with an extended deadline? Was it a breath of fresh air to go from one to the other, or is it, would you miss the structure of daily deadlines when it comes to writing your fiction?
The first book was freedom because you didn't have a deadline, right? When I first came up with Russell, when I first wrote the initial scene of Line of Sight, I didn't have an agent. I didn't have any idea how anything in publishing worked. I would argue I probably still barely have a grasp of it. But, it was just the other thing I was doing. It was more of a hobby. It was relaxing. And it was more of some ways a place to take my frustrations out. It still is, obviously I still enjoy it. I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't. And it is still a good place to work some things out you experience during the day now. But I don't know how you felt about this in the day in, day out reporting, but daily deadlines don't bother me that much. I guess because I do a lot of breaking news or a lot of court coverage, a lot of verdicts. I know there's going to be a ticking clock at the end of the day. The long deadline actually scares me more because it gives me too much room to screw around. I can decide, I can't decide somebody just got convicted of a triple homicide that the LA Times wants to put on the front page. I can't decide, I'll finish it whenever. That's got to get done by 6 o'clock, right? Or else someone's going to come screaming at me. With this, it was more, especially this one, it was more, okay, you started it I started writing this in late 2019. We sold it around the same timeline the site came out. And then it was suddenly you have 7 months to write 80,000 words. And there were lulls. It never went, weeks without writing, but there were definitely a couple of day stretches where it was just nothing is coming out. I don't know how to force it to come out. Russell's on mute or whatever. It wasn't that part of my brain just wasn't working. And those were definitely, those are more stressful when I just couldn't get out of first gear on some days.
Yeah. I mean, my experience was I didn't like the year-end deadline. I was used to every day having to produce. So I don't know how I did it, but I tried to transfer the idea of getting something done every day. And it's hard when you have a daytime job. I mean, most novelists start out with day jobs, probably 99% of them. I don't think there's very few novelists that just kind of like at 21 are writing novels, but there's a few. But your day job also happens to be writing, and it's high pressure, high stakes writing, especially in a media centric town like LA. Yeah, there are consequences if you screw up, if you get something wrong. And then when you go into your fiction, there aren't those kind of consequences. So was there like a psychological relief? Was it therapy? And maybe I'm asking the same question again, but I remember those days and how much I was at the paper doing my daily stories, but longing to get home and get into the fiction.
Well, you're just being a good journalist because I accidentally sidestepped your question. You're right. I didn't answer it. It's freeing. It's certainly freeing to some extent with, I guess, what you can play with, right? Like this one, the crime that we looked at in the opening scene, it borrows elements from a real Newark murder, a pretty famous one. That's really only known in Central and North Jersey. But yeah, I didn't have to adhere to the details of it, right? Whereas normally if I'm describing something graphic or something violent or just the action of a sequence in a news article, I have to check the criminal complaint, right, 3, 4, 5 times, or the preliminary hearing transcript or whatever, the interview notes with whatever detective or victim I talked to that day. This was kind of more, that whole scene that we just read, I kind of just fell out of me one day, and that was it. There was no checking. For something like that in fiction and in journalism, right, I'd be checking an LAFD after action report or some kind of statement that's in a court file, and not having to constantly, underline and double check everything was certainly nice.
Your answer played into my next question. The book is dedicated to, this is for the Clinton Avenue 5, whose story should not be lost to history. Is that the crime that you said inspired this? And I know nothing about that. Is there a short summary of why this book is dedicated to the Clinton Avenue 5?
Yeah, so the Clinton Avenue 5 was a case I only wrote 2 or 3 stories about, but it was a cold case from the late 1970s in Newark. A group of teenage boys went missing in 1978 and were never heard from again. There was never a crime scene. There were never bodies. Their social security numbers were never used, and no one had any clue what happened to them. The families got so desperate they were checking the records from the Heaven's Gate mass suicide. They were calling in psychics. Nobody could get anywhere near close to solving this case. And then in the middle of a night shift in 2010, when I'm at the Star-Ledger, I get sent out to the courthouse in Newark because they're perp walking the guy who killed the Clinton Avenue 5. Apparently, one of his cousins or somebody had basically claimed I was under arrest and had cut a deal with prosecutors, claiming that this other man who ended up getting tried for the crime had lured these boys to an abandoned house, nailed the closet shut, trapped them inside at gunpoint, and burned it down with them inside. The motive being that they stole a pound of marijuana from him. He was ultimately the man's name is Lee Evans. He was ultimately acquitted of that crime because they never had any physical evidence. They never had a crime scene, and there were a lot of questions if the informant in that case had just basically concocted this tale to save his own skin. And I interviewed him about a year before I moved to LA. And it just kind of stuck with me, both the gruesome nature of the way they described the crime, a lot of the circumstances about the kind of laziness of the early investigation. And then there's the idea that this guy could get put on national news. There was CNN coverage of this briefly, and tried for multiple counts of homicide with no physical evidence and just on the word of one guy. Those circumstances really kind of never left my head. So when I started trying to come up with a second Russell book, I knew no matter what the plot was going to be, I wanted that crime to be part of it because it's just lived in my head for so long, and I feel like more people should know about it. I don't know why this is just, of all the things people think of when they think of Jersey crime, they think of the mafia or bodies in the Pine Barrens or urban legends, but there are real awful, miserable cases like this that just are kind of just floating around. Nobody really knows about.
Well, maybe that answers this next question. I was going to say, I know from reading the stories you write in the LA Times that you know LA and you know the LAPD and the politics of this place very well, like the back of your hand. So it's like, why Bricktown? Why Newark?
Because I still feel to this day, I actually had a better command of Newark than I do of LA now. Although the fact that you're telling me maybe I know it that well, I'm going to change that assessment. But yeah, I was in Newark for 5 years. It was kind of always where I learned to report. Really, I hadn't done criminal justice that long before I went there. I had done some crime reporting for my campus paper and a little bit freelancing for the New York Daily News, but I didn't really do the day in, day out running on scenes and being enmeshed in not just the police department, but the activists. So even some of the gang sets I had sources in, like I just ended up learning the place really well. And it always fascinated me. And it just never really seemed to pop up in pop culture enough. When you think of crime fiction or crime pop culture, obviously you think of LA, you think of New York, The Wire kind of shoved Baltimore into the national consciousness that way. In Newark, it's a city of 250,000 people, a lot of political intrigue, a lot of violent crime, at least at the time I was there. Unfortunately, it's getting better now. And just no one talked about it. So I guess I just kind of wanted to, put the Brick City in that arena, at least. It's just another place that matters, that counts, and that has stories and people that should be elevated and told.
Well, I'm not trying to be funny here, but what are the big differences in the two places, LA and New Jersey and Newark? And don't say one is a sunny place for shady people and the other place is just shady. I really mean talking about the character of police and politics. How is the milieu, if I can use a big word, different or exactly the same? Or almost the same?
I'm going to pretend I know what milieu means. I'm just a simple cop reporter. No.
You're a novelist, man.
That is true. That is true. I got to take that alleged author thing out of the Twitter bio. The size is obviously different, but also just the amount of people that have eyes on things. Newark it's still not incestuous I guess it is the right word. Like, put it this way, a guy that I covered as a street activist at the beginning of my time in Newark, he was a councilman, but he really came up, as a guy with a megaphone on a street corner, is now the mayor and is nationally well known. It was a much shorter path to power. It was a much smaller nexus of who knew, you didn't have, this is not to knock anybody on the LA City Council and even in the LAPD, but right, like the police chief lives way, way outside the city. A lot of the command staff live way outside of the city. And that goes for a lot of the agencies. It's no knock on the PD, the fire, DA's office, all of these people. Like, we're Newark for the most part, except for the highest levels of power. A lot of the cops, a lot of the people, they had ties to the city. They knew one another. It was just kind of more of a gravitational pull to the place. Like I said, yeah, like when I was there, Cory Booker, who I'm sure a lot of people on this call know who that is at least, was the mayor. And yeah, he did live in the city for a good amount of time. Whereas, I don't think you see that with a lot of powerful LA politicians. It just, I don't know, people own their block more there. And I've always, as a reporter, preferred to do more local than national. So I've always been more drawn to that city. Like, I'm not leaving LA. My wife is listening to this call. We're not moving. Don't worry. But yeah, that's something about Newark has just always appealed to me and makes me want to write about it. And it's probably just that people don't feel the need to get out of it, I guess.
Well, to use a phrase you just said, like, if you write local, you can actually tell a national story. And you seem to be, I think a focus in these books is the point of intersection between police and politics and the social zeitgeist. So, do you know what zeitgeist means?
Yeah, actually, that one I got.
All right, good. But so a story about Newark, the story can be about Newark, but it's also a bigger story. It's about, the kind of police corruption and abuses and issues, justice issues that we have seen, across the country kind of explode in recent years. So do you write in a vacuum, or how much of the outside world invades the creative mind when you're just starting out with ideas for a book? Like you're influenced by the Clanton Avenue case, and then you bring in stuff that's happening in the world and that's important in this country. So do you try to be open to it and let it come in and influence you, or do you wish you could kind of close off the outside influences?
No, I mean, I draw a lot on reality. This one is a specific case. Line of Sight was not, but what is going on in that political moment, generally speaking, usually, no, not the political moment, the criminal justice political moment, I guess they're, intertwined, usually will influence whatever is going to be the main thrust of the book. I have been writing a lot about wrongful convictions, and that underpinned this one. I obviously did not plan to write a story about a possible wrongful use of force homicide for the first book, and then George Floyd is murdered 2 months later. Obviously I didn't know that was going to happen, and it wasn't a specific Newark case I was thinking of for that, but just kind of drawing on a lot of, we were just talking about how Newark and LA are different, but at the same time, in some ways, a city is a city is a city, and you can see a lot of the same, imbalance of power sometimes between police and who they protect and serve, or the justice is very different for wealthy people versus not, in Line of Sight. And in this one, we deal a lot, I don't spare shots at our industry either. I don't spare shots at the media. There are things we don't cover and don't pay attention to. It's been up recently again, and I didn't plan for this to happen now, but the concept of missing white woman syndrome comes up in this book here and there. And we've been talking about that lately with certain things in the national news cycle. So it's not something I intend to do. It's just something I kind of can't prevent doing, between just working at a national newspaper and consuming as much news as I do on a daily basis. It's always there. And I don't really know how to firewall it off. And I don't know if that would be a good idea.
Right. I'm glad people can hear your voice, because I think it's helpful when they read this book, since you've admitted that Russell Avery is close to you. To me, you're kind of writing like a contemporary Raymond Chandler, 60 plus years later or whatever, 3,000 miles away. But there is a kind of a world-weary, sardonic side to Avery. And, you just read the opening about this horrible crime, but there's actually, I don't know what, there's like a thread of humor in the way he tells his story. In this first person narration that kind of made me smile as I read. I'm going to just read one real little excerpt here. I flipped the light switch and directed the lieutenant to an IKEA adjacent chair I'd bought off Craigslist for $12. It creaked under his weight. That's what $12 chairs do. That kind of delivery is very Chandler-esque to me. And so I was wondering if you, and I might be totally wrong about this, but can you talk about how you've been influenced by the writing of the earlier generations in this genre? And is it, and the second part of that question, is it hard to capture that in a contemporary novel where there's so much technology and cell phones and internet and blah, blah, blah? I mean, I have a hard time picturing Philip Marlowe in today's world, but Russell Avery functions just fine, I believe, as a worthy heir, to him. So can you talk about that a little bit, where the writing influences were for you?
Sure. It's a weird hybrid. I love Chandler. Big Sleep is unfortunately not staged here properly where it should be, but and I'm always honored to get those comparisons. The humor comes from a mix of I'm a big Jonathan Lethem guy, and some of his earlier stuff was more crime fiction oriented, and it's kind of always a borderline of crime fiction and speculative fiction. And his characters are kind of always a little bit more in the Russ role, right? They're semi-competent underdogs, but there's a lot of humor in there, almost as a defense mechanism. I'm also a huge comic book nerd, so I think sometimes my narration is honestly influenced by the little yellow boxes you would normally see in a Spider-Man comic. I mean, the Peter Parker humor defense mechanism is definitely woven into Russell. There's at least one Spider-Man reference in this novel. There is one in the first one, so it bleeds over from there. I'm trying to think who else, because I'm trying like Dennis Lehane is a hero. More recently, and probably a little bit infecting this because I was reading Blacktop Wasteland, which is now on the cover of this novel. As I was writing this, Sean Cosby tends to move very frequently between darkness and humor. I don't think my voice lends itself to full on grim dark. I think some of the levity makes the rougher or more emotional moments hit better. I just kind of like that balance. And I mean, if all else fails, an explanation, I was raised by a cop and raised around cops, and as well as anybody, gallows humor is pretty prevalent in that crowd, and it's just infected the way I talk and think. So it's not surprising to me that it bled into Russell.
So why didn't you become a cop? How come you became a writer?
I thought about it for a little bit there, but ultimately I don't think I'd be very good at it. Honestly, it's just that simple. I don't give orders well. I'm just kind of do my own thing, and I'm not really big on having. I don't know. I just don't think I would do well in a role of authority, even something as small as beat cop work. Sorry, Dad, if you're listening, but to his credit, he was never super pushy about that anyway. I've always been interested in the world of it. Once I started writing about it as a journalist, it pretty much became a lock. I was going to do criminal justice beat work, and I don't know when I'm ever going to do anything different. But yeah, it just didn't appeal to me.
So, all right. So you don't want to be a cop. What would you be if you weren't a writer then?
Oh God. Hopefully in the NBA, but I'm not tall or talented enough. My loves are few and far between beyond writing. And beyond writing fiction. I had brief flirtations with wanting to do radio and kind of sports play-by-play. There's a VHS tape somewhere that my mom has as blackmail of me doing play-by-play of the final minutes of a Knicks-Pacers playoff game when I was 10 years old somewhere. I'm not half bad at that. I guess that would probably – I'm an NBA aficionado, if that's not patently obvious by now. So that'd probably be the only other arena I think I could find myself trying to work in. It'd be something – sports or broadcast related.
All right. So what are you going to do? You talk a little bit about the pressure of when you wrote your first book. I think you said, or once you told me that you wrote it over a 4-year period, then you get it published and suddenly you're in the cycle and they come to you and say you got 7 months to write your next one. What does that do to you as a writer?
I mean, it was the combination of suddenly having this, at least to me still, massive undertaking of trying to write an entire book. At the point that we pitched it and sold it, the sequel to Paulus, I think I'd written about the first 10,000 words, so maybe first 4 or 5 or 6 chapters, and then I had, I don't know what the work ended up being, but that was maybe 10% of the book, 15% of the book. So yeah, suddenly that seemed like an enormous Herculean task, and we were in the pandemic. So a lot of times when I'm stuck writing, I try to do something else. I go for a run, or we just go out and do something else, go for a hike, try to go somewhere where I can empty my head out. That was, I guess I was still running during the pandemic, but beyond that, there was no, we were stuck in the 3 rooms in our apartment. I normally write and work in our guest bedroom, and you could definitely, the days that it was not coming out, you kind of felt the walls closing in a little bit. There really was not a good way to kind of just turn off the motor and turn it back on. If I wasn't, on days I wasn't writing, I was being anxious about not writing, or I was waking up, and I'm not trying to sound dramatic here, but towards the end, I have a witness. There were at least 3 different times I woke up at 2 a.m. and was like, shit, this plot element is wrong, and jumped out of bed and tried to go back and mess with it, and ultimately ended up thankfully not saving any of those changes. I don't know about you, but most of what I write at 4 a.m. is barely in English. So yeah, there was a lot more panic and a lot more concern, a lot more of that voice that this is bad or that I was doing it too fast. But once I got it, like everybody says, finish the hat, get it out on the page and see what's there. Once I got it in the hands of a few beta readers, things kind of calmed down and it became enjoyable again. And I'm just hoping that, whatever the next project is, be it a third Russ book, be it something different, that maybe I can mute that voice a little bit the next time, because, you're tripe, but it's true. You're your own harshest critic, and being trapped inside for the whole writing period did not help with that.
So what about your experience with editing? In newspapers, it can be, bare knuckle brawling in the newsroom, where you read the paper the next day and you don't even recognize your story because somebody edited it without your involvement. And then, that was my experience. And then I got into publishing books, and it just became this genteel world of like, have you thought about this? Could you try that? That kind of thing. Have you dealt with that? Like, wow, this is pretty nice, or what's your experience?
Jason, if you're listening, I am not sucking up to you. Jason is the publisher and editor of Paulus. Very light hand. Honestly, my edits for the 2 novels have been less painful than at least 20 articles I can think of recently. And any LA Times editors listening, sorry, but at least I'm not going to name you. But I have way, way more fights about a 700-word piece and what the lead should be and what the headline language should be, and if we're framing something right in a short span of time than I did with either of these books. I was lucky. I've yet to experience the third act doesn't work, rewrite it, or you need to change who the killer is, or Russell's unlikable, or any of those kind of massive open heart surgery has to be done on the book edits. I've avoided that. That happens way too often with news articles, though, and I don't know what it is, but I guess my ego gets more wounded in journalism than it does in fiction, and I don't think that makes sense, but it's just how my brain is wired. So I'm way more, ready to curse, fight, kick, and scream over an article than I am over the fiction. So if you were asking about escape or reprieve or relief earlier, that's really where it comes in for me, at least with the fiction, is the editing process has just been so much more, you're wonderful and you're great than the journalism process usually is.
What have you done for me lately? I just checked the list of names, and I don't think your editor's on there, so you can tell the truth.
That's true. Well, Shelby promised me he wouldn't be here, so I'm not going to get fired at least.
I did see some of your colleagues, including the great Richard Winton, on there. So be careful what you say about the journalism world.
Winton, we're off the record.
Yeah. Okay, so what we're coming near to the end here, and I think there's at least one question from the audience, but a couple more from me. What comes up next for you?
I have a loose idea for a third Russ book that I really don't want to get into any detail on because it might give away some things about the ending of the second one.
It will be a Russell.
I'm not 100% sure. There is an idea for another book in this series. I also, kind of mentioned some of the nerd affections before. I have a close friend of mine that's always been kind of a writing partner and set of eyes on stuff. We've had an idea for a kind of more of a speculative fiction, still some crime elements, but more in the sci-fi, I guess tech noir might be the best way to put it, direction. I've been reading a lot of Ben Winters lately, who's a LA local and a big spec fiction guy, big influence on that project. We have a really elaborate world build for that, and it would be set in Los Angeles. That is probably the next thing I'm going to try to do, but considering that's ambitious and wieldy, and if you can't tell, I already sound scared of the enormity of it, I may run back to the safe confines of Newark or wherever Russ finds himself at the end of the book.
Plus, you have only 7 months to write your next one.
I hope not. I didn't sign anything yet this time, so maybe not.
Well, I think that's. I'm glad to hear that you might be, or you're heading towards doing an LA story. I think it would be very good because of your experience here and what you know. I look forward to that. So we got one question, so we'll finish up with this question from the audience, and it's: do you find it more difficult to create a character from scratch or to disguise one that is based on a real life person? That kind of goes to your saying that Russell is a lot based on you.
That's a really good question. I think it's a twofold answer. I mean, obviously Russell is easier to play with because I can kind of meld in pieces of my own personality. Hiding characters is definitely harder because there are definitely, reporters from the Ledger that have read the first book. They can certainly identify who's who, but yeah, a number of the police characters in the first book, one of the activists, they're generally, they have their own distinct personalities, they have their own different backstories, but they're still kind of molded off of specific either sources or other types of people that I knew back there. And that's been an interesting game to, the more people from Newark that read it, even ex-cops, I'm kind of amused to see who can hit the bullseye and who can't as to who these people are. But I actually do think it's harder to disguise, because especially when I take somebody that might have been, somebody I really get along with personally in real life, but use them as kind of the base for a character that might be shown in an unflattering light in the book. I want to hide who they are because I don't want that person to get insulted. But in short fiction, it's definitely, I've written about like 10 or 11 short stories I've had published, I think. Those, obviously, I don't use protagonists that are, within 6 degrees of separation from me. And those are the times really for me that the blank page is scary, when it's just kind of like I have to basically, again, not to sound dramatic, but just like give birth to like a whole fully formed person as the viewpoint character. Russ is a bit of a cheat code.
So are you moving any characters that you've come across here in LA, police department or otherwise, and are we seeing them transformed into characters in these stories in the Northeast?
All These Ashes has a couple of people I could think of that are derivative from LA characters. It's kind of an interesting blend. Some of the newer characters, some of the characters that are not holdovers from Line of Sight have, they're kind of hybrids of Newark people, LA people, and just, my own imagination. The short fiction, there's something, I mean, I can announce it now, I guess. I was going to announce it tomorrow. There's a short story anthology coming out from the folks at Rock and a Hard Place, which is a local crime fiction magazine, that they're doing about police abuses and oppression. And while that story is set in Staten Island, the main character is definitely stolen or borrowed or mutated version of a couple of different people that I've dealt with in LA in the past 2 years. So they're starting, LA sources, LA people, neighbors, whoever, they're starting to invade Jersey, I guess, fictionally.
All right. I guess a wrap-up question. This might be the hardest question. Do you think there's a message in this story, in this book? Are you trying to put a message in there, or are you simply just entertaining?
I mean, this one definitely was heavily influenced, and I've written a lot of stories lately about wrongful convictions and just looking back at kind of how oversimplified things were for juries in the 80s and 90s. It's really just ask questions. I try to be fair in these books and in my journalism to law enforcement, to police. Like I said, I got family and close friends in law enforcement. But there are a lot of times that we don't think critically about how they act. And I'm not even talking about situations where I'm not necessarily even talking about corruption or excessive force. Sometimes I'm just talking about, when a mistake is made in law enforcement, right, as opposed to I make a mistake in my job, the ramifications are enormous. And when we, either as journalists or just members of the public, don't necessarily question certain things tactically, you can have irreparable harm done. So it's not necessarily, and this is the same thing I said about the first book, even when it's just to be critical, but not necessarily to be, not the assumption that everything that's being done is wrong, but to maybe steer more away from the assumption that everything being done is right.
Cool. That actually wasn't the last question, because someone has weighed in with a question late in the game here. Considering some of the major crimes you've covered, some stranger than fiction, for example, Bob Durst and Suge Knight, do you envision writing any nonfiction books about some of the cases you have covered?
I've thought about it. Neither of those cases. There are a couple of serial predators, actually one caught by our mutual friend Mitzi Roberts. Sam Little was a serial killer that was caught a couple of years back and has been linked to something north of 90 homicides around the U.S. He's somebody I've sometimes thought about trying to figure out a way to do a nonfiction project about. But given, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, given the fact that I am, shackled to facts and objectivity all day, every day, the idea of then only extending that workload and pressure into the otherwise escapism of fiction writing, that's kind of a spooky thought. So it's a non-zero chance that I would do nonfiction, but it's not high.
Yeah, I've never really wanted to do it once I left the reporting ranks. So this is the book, very good book, and the one before it, Line of Sight, is good as well. And order it from Book Soup. And thanks for coming and listening to us. And James, I hope in about 30 years you're at Book Soup in person, and you're interviewing a young novelist who's a reporter at the LA Times. And it will be fun to do, as this has been fun for me. So thanks for being here tonight and telling us about your books.
I would love to take the torch pass. Thank you so much for doing it. Thank you, everybody who tuned in.
Thank you both so much. That was a great conversation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And don't forget to get your copy with a signed bookplate of All These Ashes at the green button right below. And if you have any questions, you can always hit us up on social media or email. And congratulations, James, on your next book. And everyone have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thank you.